A love story written in smoke. Juliana Costa had spent her life pretending she was normal, that her last name didn't come with a legacy written in blood. But when a single black envelope appeared on her doorstep marked with her father's crest, she knew her past had finally caught up. She returned to Naples expecting threats. What she didn't expect was him. Salvatore de Rossi, the man she had once loved, now standing at her father's right hand. He watched her, dark-eyed and unreadable. "You should have stayed gone," he murmured. "Now you belong to this world again." Chapter 1. The Black Envelope Summons. The late afternoon sun, a hazy orange orb sinking towards the horizon, cast long shadows across Juliana Costa's meticulously tended garden. Roses, her particular passion, bloomed in a riot of color, their velvety petals unfurling in the gentle breeze. A scene of perfect tranquility, a world away from the life she'd tried so desperately to leave behind. She snipped a particularly vibrant crimson bloom, its thorns catching momentarily on the soft cotton of her gardening glove. A prick, a tiny bead of blood welling up. A premonition, perhaps, of the disruption that was about to shatter her carefully constructed peace. Juliana had built this life, brick by painstaking brick, in the quiet, unassuming town of Bellagio, overlooking the serene waters of Lake Como. Far removed, she had hoped, from the turbulent currents of Naples, the city of her birth, the city that held both her sweetest memories and her deepest sorrows. She had been living under an assumed name, a simpler version, Giulia Carati, a name without the weight of history, of expectation, of fear. For 20 years, she had been Giulia, the quiet widow, the dedicated gardener, the friendly neighbor. The facade had been almost perfect. Almost. The postman, a jovial, round-faced man named Marco, who always had a kind word and a biscuit for her aging golden retriever, Leo, had delivered the envelope that morning. He hadn't noticed anything unusual, just another piece of mail amidst the usual bills and catalogs. But Juliana had recognized it instantly. Black, heavy cardstock, the paper itself whispering of wealth and power. And in the corner, embossed in a deep, almost menacing crimson, was the crest. The Costa crest. A coiled serpent, its fangs bared, encircling a stylized sword. Her father's crest. She hadn't opened it immediately. She'd placed it on the antique writing desk in her study, a room filled with books and the faint scent of lavender and old paper, and tried to go about her day. She'd made pasta from scratch, the rhythmic kneading of the dough usually a soothing ritual, but today, her hands trembled, the familiar motions failing to calm the growing unease in her chest. She'd walked Leo along the lakefront, the stunning beauty of the water and the surrounding mountains usually a balm to her soul, but today, she saw only the shadows, the hidden depths, the potential for storms. Now, as the last rays of sunlight faded, she sat on the small stone bench in her garden, the black envelope resting heavily in her lap. It felt cold, despite the lingering warmth of the day. Her fingers traced the outline of the serpent, the raised edges sharp beneath her touch. Her father, Don Antonio Costa, was dead. She knew that, had known it for 5 years. A heart attack, they'd said. Sudden, unexpected. Though, in their world, unexpected often had a more sinister connotation. She hadn't gone to the funeral. Couldn't. The thought of returning to Naples, of facing the family, the whispers, the accusations, it had been too much. She had mourned him in her own way, in the quiet solitude of her self-imposed exile. But the crest, it meant something. It meant someone new. Someone had found her. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, she finally broke the seal. The single sheet of paper inside was thick, creamy, and bore only a few lines, written in a precise, elegant script. Juliana, your presence is required. Naples. The Villa. October 27th. Noon. Your father's affairs are not yet settled. Your inheritance awaits. Come alone. No signature. None was needed. She knew who it was from. Lorenzo, her cousin, her father's closest advisor, the man who had always been the shadow to her father's light, or perhaps the darkness to his fire. The man who, even as a child, had made her skin crawl. The words were stark, formal, yet they carried an undercurrent of something else. Threat? Warning? Or something more complicated? The phrase "your inheritance awaits" resonated with a chilling ambiguity. What inheritance? Her father's wealth? His power? His enemies? She looked out at the darkening lake, the lights of the distant villages twinkling like fallen stars. The beauty that had once brought her solace now felt like a cruel mockery. Her peaceful life, her carefully crafted identity, were crumbling around her. She could refuse. She could simply ignore the summons. But she knew, deep in her heart, that she wouldn't. The serpent had found her. The past had caught up. And she, Juliana Costa, the daughter of the dawn, had a debt to pay, whether she wanted to or not. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the olive trees, carrying with it the scent of the lake and a faint, almost imperceptible trace of something else, something metallic, something that reminded her of gunpowder and blood. She felt a chill, despite the warmth of her shawl, a premonition of the darkness she was about to step back into. And she knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in her stomach, that her life, as she knew it, was over. She carefully folded the note and placed on the desk next to a framed picture. Her and a young Salvatore. She would pack light, and that would be the only relic of her past she would take. The first tear, a lonely sentinel, traced a path down her cheek. Chapter 2. Return to the Shadowed City. The train rattled through the Italian countryside, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the frantic beat of Juliana's heart. Each clack of the wheels against the tracks was a countdown, drawing her closer to Naples, closer to the life she had so desperately tried to escape. She watched the landscape blur past, fields of sunflowers giving way to rolling hills, then to the grimy outskirts of the city. The vibrant beauty of the countryside felt a world away from the concrete and chaos that awaited her. She hadn't slept properly since receiving the black envelope. Nightmares, vivid and disturbing, had plagued her sleep. Images of her father, his face both stern and loving, his voice a mixture of command and affection. Images of shadowed figures, whispers of betrayal, the cold glint of steel. And always, always, the serpent, coiling, watching, waiting. She had chosen a simple, dark dress for the journey, a concession to the woman she once was, the woman she was about to become again. No jewelry, save for the small, silver cross she always wore, hidden beneath her clothes, a tangible link to her faith, a fragile shield against the darkness she knew she would face. Her hair, once long and flowing, was now cut in a practical, shoulder-length style, the dark strands streaked with silver, a testament to the years, to the stress, to the secrets. She'd left Leo with Marco, a wrenching goodbye that had brought tears to both their eyes. The dog had sensed her distress, whimpering softly, his brown eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "I'll be back," she'd whispered, her voice choked with emotion, though a part of her wondered if that was a lie. As the train pulled into Naples Central, the city's main railway station, a wave of memories, both bitter and sweet, washed over her. The cacophony of sounds, the shouts of vendors, the rumble of traffic, the incessant chatter of Neapolitan dialect assaulted her senses. The smell, a unique blend of exhaust fumes, sea salt, and the ever-present aroma of espresso, was both familiar and foreign. She had arranged for a car, a discreet black sedan, to meet her at the station. The driver, a stoic, middle-aged man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, greeted her with a curt nod. "Signora Costa," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. He didn't offer to help with her small suitcase. She hadn't expected him to. The drive through the city was a blur of narrow, winding streets, lined with ancient buildings, their facades crumbling, their balconies overflowing with laundry and vibrant flower boxes. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of barely suppressed energy, of secrets hidden beneath the surface. She saw the familiar landmarks, the imposing Castel Nuovo, the majestic Duomo, the bustling Piazza del Plebiscito, but they seemed different, viewed through the lens of her apprehension. The villa, her father's villa, was located on the Pozzolippo Hill, overlooking the Bay of Naples. A sprawling, opulent estate, surrounded by high walls, guarded by wrought iron gates, and shrouded in an air of both grandeur and menace. As the car climbed the winding road, the city spread out below her, a glittering tapestry of lights against the darkening sky. The beauty was breathtaking, but it couldn't mask the underlying sense of unease that gripped her. The gates swung open silently as they approached, revealing a long, cypress-lined driveway that led to the imposing entrance of the villa. The house itself was a masterpiece of Neapolitan Baroque architecture, its pale yellow facade bathed in the soft glow of strategically placed spotlights. It was beautiful, yes, but it also felt like a prison. As the car stopped, the driver opened her door, his eyes averted. She stepped out, her legs feeling strangely unsteady. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and something else, something indefinable, something that spoke of power and danger. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing pulse. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. As she approached the massive, carved wooden doors, they swung open, revealing a dimly lit entrance hall, the air cool and still. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, imposing, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. Lorenzo. He hadn't changed much. His hair was still thick and black, though now streaked with silver at the temples. His face, always sharp and angular, was now etched with deeper lines, a map of his ambition, his ruthlessness. His eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Juliana," he said, his voice a low, smooth rumble, like the distant sound of thunder. "You came." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A confirmation of his power, of his control. "I did," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I received your invitation." He smiled, a slow, chilling curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome home, cousin." The word home felt like a mockery, a cruel twist of a knife. This was not her home. Not anymore. This was a battleground. And she was walking straight into the lion's den. He turned, gesturing for her to follow him. As she moved, her heels clicked on the marble floor, echoing on the grand foyer. She noticed someone on the stairs, half hidden in shadows. It was Salvatore. A strange and unfamiliar dread twisted in her chest. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She was back. And the game, whatever it was, had begun. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Past. Echoes of Betrayal. The villa's interior was a study in opulent decay. Grand, but with a veneer of neglect, as if the life had slowly drained out of it since Juliana's father's death. The vast rooms were filled with antique furniture, heavy drapes, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, old wood, and a faint, lingering trace of her father's favorite cigars. Lorenzo led her through a labyrinth of corridors, past closed doors and silent rooms, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. He spoke little, offering only cryptic remarks about the necessary formalities and the complexity of your father's estate. Juliana remained silent, observing, absorbing, trying to decipher the unspoken messages, the hidden agendas. They finally reached a large, wood-paneled study, the room that had been her father's inner sanctum. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany desk, its surface cluttered with papers, a crystal ashtray overflowing with cigar butts, and a single, black telephone. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, and a large portrait of Don Antonio Costa hung above the fireplace, his gaze seeming to pierce through her. "Sit," Lorenzo said, gesturing to a leather armchair facing the desk. He remained standing, positioning himself near the fireplace, his presence dominating the room. Juliana sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She felt a strange mix of fear and familiarity, of dread and a perverse sense of homecoming. This room, This house held so many memories, both good and bad. It was here that she had learned to play chess with her father, here that she had hidden from the world during her teenage rebellions, here that she had first encountered Salvatore Derossi. The thought of Salvatore sent a shiver down her spine. She hadn't seen him clearly on the stairs, only a fleeting glimpse of his silhouette, but even that had been enough to stir a cauldron of conflicting emotions. He had been her father's protégé, a young man of fierce loyalty and undeniable charisma, a man who had, for a brief, passionate period, been her lover. A forbidden love, a dangerous love, a love that had ended in betrayal and heartbreak. "You're wondering why I summoned you," Lorenzo said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. He picked up a silver letter opener from the desk, turning it over and over in his hands, the light glinting off its sharp edge. "It was unexpected," Juliana replied, choosing her words carefully. "My father and we were not close in his later years." Lorenzo's lips curved into a thin smile. "Estranged, some might say. But blood is blood, Juliana. And you are, after all, his only heir. And what exactly does that entail?" He finally put down the letter opener, his gaze locking with hers. "Your father left behind a complicated legacy. Debts, both financial and otherwise. Obligations. Enemies." "Enemies?" "The Costa name carries weight, Juliana. But it also carries a price. There are those who would see the family fall. Those who believe your father's death left a void, a weakness to be exploited. And you? What do you believe?" He moved closer, his shadow falling across her. "I believe in loyalty. In family. In upholding the traditions, the code. The code. The unspoken rules. The intricate web of obligations and vendettas that govern their world. A world she had tried so hard to escape." "And Salvatore?" she asked, the name escaping her lips before she could stop it. "Where does he fit into all of this?" Lorenzo's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. "Salvatore is loyal. To the family. To your father's memory. He is essential to the current arrangements." "Arrangements?" He ignored her question. "He is a valuable asset. A strong right hand. He understands the intricacies of our world." Juliana felt a surge of anger, a bitter taste in her mouth. Salvatore, an asset? A strong right hand? He was more than that. He had been more than that. To her. To her father. "I want to see him," she said, her voice firm. Lorenzo hesitated, his gaze shifting away. "That is not advisable. At this time." "Why not?" "He is occupied. With matters of importance." "He was on the stairs. I saw him." Lorenzo sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Salvatore has his duties, Juliana. He is not here for your personal amusement." "It's not amusement, Lorenzo. It's unfinished business." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The unfinished business of a broken heart, of a betrayed trust, of a love that had been both her salvation and her destruction. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark and probing. "Very well," he said finally. "But be warned, Juliana. Salvatore is not the boy you remember. He has changed. We all have." He turned and walked towards the door. "I will arrange a meeting. But for now, you will rest. You will familiarize yourself with your surroundings. And you will stay out of trouble." He paused at the doorway, his hand on the ornate brass handle. "This is not Bellagio, cousin. This is Naples. And here, the past is never truly buried." He left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Juliana sat alone in the silence, the weight of her father's portrait pressing down on her. The whispers of the past, the echoes of betrayal, swirled around her, a suffocating embrace. She was home, and she was more lost than ever. She looked towards the windows. It was night, and she knew she wasn't going to sleep. Chapter 4. The Unseen Scars of Salvatore Derossi. The summons came the next morning, delivered not by Lorenzo, but by a young woman, barely more than a girl, with wide, frightened eyes and a tremor in her voice. "Signora Costa," she whispered, her gaze darting nervously around the hallway. "Signor Derossi, requests your presence. In the garden, Juliana had spent a restless night, tossing and turning in the unfamiliar bed, the silence of the villa punctuated by the distant sounds of the city and the unsettling creaks and groans of the old house. She had risen early, dressed in a simple black skirt and a cream-colored blouse, a concession to the Neapolitan heat, and had wandered through the deserted rooms, trying to reconcile the memories of her childhood with the stark reality of her present. The garden, at least, offered a semblance of the peace she craved. It was a walled oasis, a hidden sanctuary from the chaos of the city. A riot of color and fragrance, with bougainvillea cascading down the ancient stone walls, lemon trees laden with fruit, and the ever-present scent of roses, a poignant reminder of her life in Bellagio. He was waiting for her near a fountain, a weathered stone cherub spouting water into a moss-covered basin. He stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, his posture rigid, almost military. He was dressed in dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, tanned forearms. His hair, still dark and thick, though now showing the first hints of silver, was cut short, a stark contrast to the longer, more unruly style he'd worn in his youth. She approached him slowly, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence until she was almost upon him. "Salvatore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned then, and Juliana felt her breath catch in her throat. He had changed. The boy she remembered, the boy with the laughing eyes and the reckless smile, was gone. In his place was a man hardened by life, by experience, by the unforgiving world they inhabited. His face was leaner, more angular, his jaw set in a firm line. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now guarded, shadowed, almost cold. "Juliana," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble, devoid of any warmth, any recognition. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the gentle splashing of the fountain. The air was thick with unspoken words, with unresolved emotions, with the ghost of a love that had once burned so brightly. "Lorenzo said you wanted to see me," she said finally, breaking the silence. "He told you I requested your presence," he corrected, his eyes fixed on hers. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He didn't answer, his gaze unwavering. He seemed to be searching for something in her face, some trace of the girl he had once known, the girl he had once loved. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice rough, almost accusing. "I was summoned," she replied. "My father's affairs." "Your father is dead," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "His affairs are no longer your concern." "Apparently, they are," she countered. "Lorenzo seems to think otherwise." "Lorenzo," he said, the name a soft hiss, a mixture of disdain and something else, respect. "Lorenzo has his own agenda." "And you? What's your agenda, Salvatore?" He took a step closer, his proximity sending a shiver of both fear and anticipation through her. "My agenda is survival," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The survival of this family, of this legacy." "And what about me? Where do I fit into your agenda?" His eyes flickered, a brief flash of something that might have been pain, or regret, or perhaps just resignation. "You don't," he said, his voice flat. "You should have stayed away." "Why?" "Because it's too dangerous? Because you can't protect me?" He laughed, a short, harsh sound, devoid of any humor. "Protect you?" he said. "From what? From whom? From myself?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The truth was, she didn't know what she feared more, the dangers of the world they inhabited, or the dangers of the feelings that still lingered, buried deep within her heart, for this man, this stranger who wore the face of her lost love. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. "You should be," he replied, his eyes dark and intense. "This world, it chews up and spits out people like you. Innocent people. People who believe in fairy tales. And you? Do you believe in fairy tales, Salvatore?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, on the shimmering blue of the Bay of Naples. "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "I believe in reality." in the cold, hard truth. And the truth is, Juliana, you don't belong here. He started to turn away, dismissing. I loved you, blurted out, feeling as raw and vulnerable as a teenager. He stilled and slowly turned back to face her. The hardness in his eyes seemed to melt for the briefest of moments. And you, he answered, his voice hoarse, but that Juliana, that Salvatore. They are dead. Buried with your father. He took her hand before she could stop him. His touch electric. He looked at her, really looked at her. And she knew it was not entirely true. Some embers still glowed. He released her. Stay away from Lorenzo. And stay away from me. He started walking, strong and powerful. The man she loved, and a man she didn't know at all. And as she watched his receding figure, she wondered who had hurt him so badly, and how she could ever hope to heal those wounds. Chapter 5. A dance of defiance and desire. The days that followed were a carefully choreographed dance, a delicate balance between defiance and desire, between the pull of the past and the uncertainty of the future. Juliana found herself caught in a web of unspoken rules and hidden agendas, navigating the treacherous currents of the Costa family, while simultaneously battling the re-emergence of feelings she had thought long buried. Lorenzo kept her close, ostensibly to guide her through the complexities of her father's estate, but Juliana suspected his motives were far more calculated. He treated her with a veneer of courtesy, but there was always an undercurrent of menace, a subtle reminder of his power, of her vulnerability. He paraded her through social gatherings, introductions to various associates and business partners, men with hard eyes and carefully veiled threats hidden within their polite conversation. She played the role of the grieving daughter, the dutiful heiress, but beneath the surface, her mind raced, searching for clues, for allies, for an escape route. Salvatore, true to his word, kept his distance. But his presence was a constant, a shadow that followed her, a silent observer in the periphery of her vision. She would catch glimpses of him across a crowded room, in the reflection of a window, a fleeting shadow in the garden, and each encounter sent a jolt of electricity through her, a mixture of fear and longing. He never spoke to her directly, but his eyes, when they met hers, spoke volumes. They were filled with a mixture of warning, regret, and something else, something that mirrored the turmoil within her own heart. One evening, Lorenzo hosted a dinner party at the villa, a lavish affair intended to showcase the Costa family's continued power and influence, despite the Don's death. The guests were a mixture of old money and new money, of politicians and businessmen, of elegantly dressed women and their powerfully built escorts. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and the underlying tension of unspoken rivalries. Juliana, dressed in a simple, elegant black gown, her hair swept up in a sophisticated style, felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Lorenzo guided her through the crowd, introducing her to various individuals, his hand possessive on her arm. She smiled, she nodded, she made polite conversation, but her mind was elsewhere, searching for a familiar face, for a glimpse of dark eyes and a stoic expression. She finally saw him, standing near a window, overlooking the moonlit garden. He was engaged in conversation with a group of men, his expression unreadable, but she could sense the coiled tension in his body, the barely suppressed power that radiated from him. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the crowded room. The world seemed to fade away, the noise and chatter disappearing, leaving only the two of them, connected by an invisible thread of shared history, of unspoken longing. He excused himself from the group and started walking towards her, his movements deliberate, his gaze unwavering. Juliana felt her heart pound in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. Lorenzo, noticing Salvatore's approach, stiffened, his hand tightening on her arm. Salvatore, he said, his voice a low warning. What is the meaning of this? Salvatore ignored him, his eyes fixed on Juliana. He stopped in front of her, his presence overwhelming, his scent a mixture of sandalwood and something darker, something untamed filling her senses. Juliana, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "May I have this dance?" It wasn't a request. It was a challenge, a defiance of Lorenzo's authority, a blatant disregard for the unspoken rules that governed their world. Lorenzo's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. "Salvatore, this is inappropriate," he hissed. "Inappropriate?" Salvatore raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "I'm simply asking my old friend for a dance." The word friend was laced with irony, with a hidden meaning that only Juliana understood. She looked at Lorenzo, his grip on her arm painful, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else, fear. She looked at Salvatore, his gaze intense, his body radiating a dangerous heat. She made her choice. "I would love to dance," she said, her voice clear and steady. She slipped her arm from Lorenzo's grasp and placed her hand in Salvatore's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, sending a jolt of electricity through her. He led her onto the dance floor, the music a slow, sensual waltz. They moved together, their bodies close, their steps perfectly synchronized, as if they had danced together 1,000 times before. The world seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them, lost in the rhythm of the music, in the intensity of their unspoken connection. "You shouldn't have done that," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Lorenzo will not be pleased." "I don't care." He pulled her closer, his body pressed against hers, his hand resting on the small of her back, sending shivers down her spine. "Why did you come back, Juliana?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why did you risk everything?" "I had to," she said. "I had to see you. I had to know what?" She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Know if what we had was real." He stopped dancing, his eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "It was real," he said, his voice hoarse. "But it was a lifetime ago. We are different people now. Are we?" He didn't answer. He simply held her gaze, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words, with unresolved emotions. The music ended, but they remained standing there, locked in each other's embrace, the world swirling around them, unnoticed, unheeded. They were dancing on the edge of a precipice, defying the rules, tempting fate, risking everything for a moment of forbidden connection. And in that moment, Juliana knew that she was lost. She had come back to Naples seeking answers, but she had found something far more dangerous, far more compelling. She had found her way back to Salvatore. And she knew, with a certainty that both terrified and exhilarated her, that there was no turning back. The next song started, a passionate tango. But they didn't move. They were too lost into each other's eyes. Chapter 6. The Costa family legacy unveiled. The dance with Salvatore had ignited a firestorm. Lorenzo's fury was palpable, a simmering rage that threatened to erupt at any moment. He avoided speaking to Juliana directly, his displeasure communicated through icy glares and curt instructions delivered by his ever-present retinue of silent, watchful men. The atmosphere in the villa became even more oppressive, the air thick with unspoken threats and hidden agendas. Juliana, however, felt a strange sense of liberation. The dance had been a reckless act, a defiance of the constraints that had been placed upon her, but it had also been a reaffirmation of her own agency, a declaration that she would not be a passive pawn in their games. She had tasted freedom, however fleetingly, and she was determined to fight for more. She began to investigate her father's affairs in earnest, spending hours in his study, poring over documents, deciphering cryptic notes, trying to piece together the puzzle of his legacy. The task was daunting, the sheer volume of information overwhelming, but she persevered, driven by a growing sense of urgency, a feeling that time was running out. She discovered that her father's business dealings were far more complex and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. He had been involved in a vast network of legitimate and illegitimate enterprises, from construction and shipping to gambling and other, more shadowy activities. He had made powerful allies, but he had also made powerful enemies. One name kept recurring in the documents, a name that sent a chill down her spine. Marco the Serpent Vitali. He was the head of a rival family, a man known for his ruthlessness and his ambition, a man who had long coveted the Costa family's power and influence. Juliana realized that her father's death had not been a simple heart attack, as she had been led to believe. It had been a carefully orchestrated assassination, a power play by Vitali to destabilize the Costa family and seize control. Lorenzo, she discovered, was deeply in debt to Vitali, a debt that had been incurred through a series of ill-advised business ventures and gambling losses. He was trapped, caught between his loyalty to the Costa family and his fear of Vitali's retribution. He had summoned Juliana not to settle her father's estate, but to use her as a bargaining chip, a way to appease Vitali and save his own skin. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been betrayed, not only by Lorenzo, but by the entire system, by the code that was supposed to protect family, to uphold honor. She was nothing more than a sacrificial lamb, offered up to the wolves to protect the pack. She confronted Lorenzo, her anger a cold, hard knot in her stomach. "You lied to me," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You brought me here under false pretenses. You're planning to sell me out to Vitali." Lorenzo didn't deny it. He simply shrugged, his expression a mixture of resignation and defiance. "It's the only way," he said, "to save the family, to prevent a war." "A war you started," she retorted, "with your recklessness, your greed." "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice rising, "to protect what is ours." "And what about me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Am I not part of this family? Am I not worth protecting?" He looked away, his gaze shifting to the portrait of her father, his expression unreadable. "You were always his favorite," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "The golden girl. The one who could do no wrong. But you ran away. You abandoned us. You have no right to judge me." "I ran away to escape this," she said, gesturing around the room, her voice filled with disgust. "This corruption, this violence, this betrayal. There is no escape, Juliana," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not from this world. Not from your blood." He turned and walked towards the door, leaving her standing alone in the study, the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her. She was trapped, caught in a web of deceit and danger, with no one to trust, no one to turn to, except, perhaps, Salvatore. She knew it was a dangerous gamble, a leap of faith into the unknown. He had warned her to stay away, had told her she didn't belong in this world. But she had seen the flicker of something in his eyes, the lingering embers of a love that had once burned so brightly. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that he was her only hope. She found him later that evening, in the garden, near the fountain where they had first spoken. He was standing in the shadows, his back to her, his posture rigid, his shoulders tense. "Salvatore," she said, her voice soft, hesitant. He turned, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice flat. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer, his gaze unwavering. She told him everything. About Lorenzo's betrayal, about Vitali's threat, about the truth of her father's death. He listened in silence, his expression unchanging, his body a coiled spring, ready to unleash its power. When she finished, he simply nodded. "I know," he said. "You knew?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "I suspected," he corrected. "Lorenzo is a weak man. A fool. He has always been a liability. Then why didn't you do anything?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I had my orders," he said, his voice low and strained. "From your father." "My father? He knew about Vitali?" "He knew everything," Salvatore said, his voice filled with a mixture of bitterness and regret. "He was playing a dangerous game. A game that ultimately cost him his life. And you? What game are you playing, Salvatore?" He turned back to her, his eyes intense, searching. "I'm trying to survive," he said. "And I'm trying to protect what's left of this family. Even if it means protecting you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was offering her his protection, his loyalty, his strength. But at what cost? "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you risk everything for me? He took a step closer, his proximity sending a shiver of both fear and longing through her. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Because, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, despite everything, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, the touch of his hand, said it all. The embers still glowed, and they were about to ignite into a flame. The moon was half covered by a clouid, just like them, half in light, half in darkness. Chapter 7. Beneath the Veil of Civility. The tentative alliance between Juliana and Salvatore was forged in secrecy, a fragile bond built on shared history, mutual distrust of Lorenzo, and a desperate need for survival. They met in the shadows, in the quiet corners of the villa, exchanging whispered conversations, piecing together the puzzle of her father's legacy, planning their next move. Salvatore revealed more about the inner workings of the Costa family, the intricate web of alliances and rivalries, the unspoken rules, and the bloody consequences of breaking them. He explained that her father had been playing a double game, outwardly cooperating with Vitali while secretly working to undermine him, gathering evidence of his crimes, hoping to expose him and reclaim the Costa family's dominance. But Vitali had been one step ahead. He had discovered her father's plan and had struck first, eliminating the Don and leaving the Costa family vulnerable, ripe for the taking. Lorenzo, weak and indebted, had been easy to manipulate, a willing pawn in Vitali's game. Juliana learned that Salvatore had been more than just her father's protégé. He had been his confidant, his right-hand man, privy to his secrets, entrusted with his most dangerous missions. He had been groomed to take over the family, to lead them into a new era. But her father's death had thrown everything into chaos, leaving Salvatore in a precarious position, caught between his loyalty to the Costa family and his distrust of Lorenzo's leadership. He had been playing his own game, silently observing, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to strike. Juliana's arrival had been an unexpected complication, a wild card that had thrown his carefully laid plans into disarray. But it had also been an opportunity. He saw in her a strength, a resilience, a determination that mirrored her father's. He saw in her a chance to reclaim what had been lost, to avenge her father's death, to restore the Costa family's honor. But he also saw in her the woman he had once loved, the woman who had haunted his dreams for years. And that, he knew, was the most dangerous complication of all. Their meetings were fraught with tension, a mixture of suspicion and attraction, of unspoken desires and carefully guarded secrets. They danced around each other, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, trying to discern the truth from the lies. One afternoon, they met in the villa's library, a vast, dimly lit room filled with ancient books and the scent of old paper and leather. Juliana had been researching her father's financial records, trying to find a way to sever the ties with Vitali, to regain control of the family's assets. "It's hopeless," she said, frustration lacing her voice. "Vitali has his claws in everything. He's covered his tracks well." Salvatore, who had been leaning against a bookshelf, watching her, straightened up. "Not everything," he said. "There's one thing he doesn't control. Something your father hid. Something Vitali desperately wants." "What?" Juliana asked, her eyes widening. Salvatore hesitated, his gaze shifting away. "It's complicated," he said. "Dangerous." "Tell me," she demanded, her voice firm. "I need to know." He took a deep breath. "Your father had a safe house," he said. "A place where he kept his most valuable possessions, his most sensitive documents. Information that could destroy Vitali." "Where is it?" "I don't know the exact location," he said. "Only your father knew that. But I know the key. The way to access it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, antique silver locket, intricately engraved with the Costa family crest, the coiled serpent. "This," he said. "This is the key." Juliana recognized it instantly. It had been her mother's locket, a gift from her father on their wedding day. She had always worn it until the day she died. Juliana had never seen it since. "My mother's locket," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I thought it was lost. Your father kept it safe, Salvatore said. He knew its significance. He knew it would be needed one day. He handed her the locket. Their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of electricity through her. She opened it, revealing 2 tiny compartments. One was empty. The other contained a small, folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a series of numbers and letters, a coded message. What does it mean? She asked. It's a cipher, Salvatore said. A code your father used to protect his secrets. I know the key to decipher it, but we need to be careful. If Lorenzo or Vitali find out about this, we're dead. Juliana looked at the locket, at the coded message, at Salvatore's intense gaze. She knew that this was a turning point, a moment of truth. They were stepping into the heart of the darkness, risking everything for a chance at redemption. She closed the locket, her fingers tightening around it. Let's do it, she said, her voice firm, resolute. Let's decipher the code. And let's take down Vitali. The determination shone in her eyes, a reflection of her father, and of something else, too. Something entirely her own. And Salvatore was going to protect that at any cost. Chapter 8.
Forbidden touches, stolen moments.
The deciphering of the code became a shared obsession, a clandestine collaboration that drew Juliana and Salvatore closer, both physically and emotionally. They worked late into the night, huddled together in the library or the garden, their heads bent over the cryptic message, their voices hushed, their bodies brushing against each other in the confined spaces. The code itself was intricate, a complex combination of numbers, letters, and symbols, a testament to her father's cunning and his paranoia. Salvatore, who had been trained by the Don in the art of cryptography, guided Juliana through the process, explaining the intricacies of the cipher, the subtle nuances of the code. As they worked, they began to talk, not just about the code, but about themselves, about their past, about their regrets, about their hopes and fears. They shared stories of their childhood, of their memories of her father, of the moments that had shaped them, the choices that had led them to this point. Juliana learned more about Salvatore's life, about his difficult upbringing, his early entry into the world of the mafia, his unwavering loyalty to her father. She saw beneath the hardened exterior, the carefully constructed facade of the ruthless enforcer, and glimpsed the vulnerability, the pain, the loneliness that he kept hidden from the world. Salvatore, in turn, saw the strength and resilience that Juliana had developed during her years in exile. He saw the woman she had become, the woman who had defied expectations, who had built a life for herself outside the confines of the family, the woman who had returned to face her demons, to reclaim her legacy. And he saw, with a growing sense of both wonder and trepidation, the woman he had never stopped loving. The forbidden touches became more frequent, more deliberate. A hand lingering on her arm, a brush of fingers against her cheek, a gaze held a fraction of a second too long. The air between them crackled with unspoken desire, with the tension of a love that was both forbidden and inevitable. One night, as they were working late in the library, their heads bent close together over the coded message, their shoulders touching, Salvatore reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His fingers lingered on her skin, sending a shiver of warmth through her. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. The world seemed to fade away, the noise and chatter of the city disappearing, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment of intense intimacy. Salvatore, she whispered, her voice barely audible.
He didn't speak.
He simply leaned in, his gaze fixed on her lips. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with anticipation. His lips brushed against hers, a tentative, questioning touch, a feather-light caress that sent a wave of heat through her. She responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate, a release of years of pent-up longing, of unspoken desires, of a love that had been denied, suppressed, but never extinguished. They clung to each other, their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating as one. The world outside ceased to exist, the dangers, the threats, the betrayals fading into insignificance. There was only the two of them, lost in the moment, in the intensity of their rediscovered connection. The kiss ended, reluctantly, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of wonder, desire, and a profound sense of unease. "This is wrong," Salvatore said, his voice hoarse, his hand still cupping her cheek. "I know," Juliana replied, her voice barely a whisper. I know." But they didn't move. They remained locked in each other's embrace, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words, with the knowledge that they were playing with fire, that they were tempting fate, that they were risking everything for a love that could never be. The stolen moments became more frequent, more intense. A quick embrace in a darkened hallway, a whispered conversation in the garden, a lingering kiss under the cover of night. They lived for those moments, for the brief glimpses of connection, for the fleeting sense of normalcy in a world that was anything but. They were a life raft, a tiny space to breath. They knew it couldn't last. They knew that the dangers were closing in, that Lorenzo's suspicions were growing, that Vitali's threat was looming. But they couldn't stop themselves. They were drawn to each other, pulled by an invisible force, a bond that had been forged in the fires of their shared past, a love that had defied time and circumstance. Juliana pulled a book from the shelves, one of the several false books they had found, with hidden compartments. "We are running out of time," she said, her eyes meeting his. He knew, and the dread was visible in his expression. The clock was ticking, and the dance was about to end. Chapter 9. The Serpent in the Garden. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, a seemingly insignificant detail in one of her father's old ledgers, a coded reference to a specific date and time. Salvatore recognized it immediately, the anniversary of his initiation into the Costa family, a day that held profound significance for him, a day that had changed his life forever. Using that date as the key, they finally cracked the code, unlocking the location of the safe house. It was a small, unassuming villa on the outskirts of Naples, hidden amidst a sprawling olive grove, a place that had been used for generations by the Costa family as a secure repository for their most valuable secrets. Juliana and Salvatore knew they had to act quickly. Lorenzo was becoming increasingly suspicious, his surveillance of Juliana more intense, his questions more probing. Vitali, they suspected, was growing impatient, his demands for a meeting with Juliana more insistent. They planned their visit to the safe house with meticulous care, choosing a moonless night, arranging for a discreet driver, creating a plausible alibi in case they were questioned. They knew the risks were enormous, that discovery would mean certain death, but they were determined to retrieve the information her father had hidden, to use it to expose Vitali and reclaim their freedom. The drive to the villa was tense, the silence in the car broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional whispered instruction from Salvatore. Juliana clutched her mother's locket, her fingers tracing the intricate engraving, drawing strength from the memory of her parents, from the legacy she was fighting to protect. The villa itself was dark and silent, shrouded in an eerie stillness. The olive trees, their gnarled branches silhouetted against the night sky, seemed to watch them, silent witnesses to their clandestine mission. Salvatore used a hidden key, concealed beneath a loose stone in the garden wall, to unlock the heavy wooden door. The interior was dusty and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay and old secrets. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the rooms frozen in time, a ghostly reminder of a life that had been abruptly interrupted. They found the safe in a hidden room behind a false wall in the library, a massive steel door secured with a complex combination lock. Salvatore, using the numbers and letters they had deciphered from the coded message, expertly manipulated the dial, the tumblers clicking softly in the silence. The door swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit space filled with shelves and drawers. They found stacks of documents, bound ledgers, and sealed envelopes, a treasure trove of information that detailed Vitali's criminal activities, his network of corrupt officials, his elaborate schemes of money laundering and extortion. They also found something else, something unexpected, something that sent a chill down Juliana's spine. A photograph, tucked away in a small, velvet-lined box. A photograph of her father, standing next to a smiling, younger Marco the Serpent Vitali. They were shaking hands, their expressions friendly, almost brotherly. Juliana stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. Her father and Vitali allies? Friends? It couldn't be true. It went against everything she had been told, everything she believed. What does this mean? She whispered, her voice trembling. Salvatore took the photograph, his face a mask of disbelief. He examined it closely, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. I don't know, he said, his voice low and strained. This changes everything. They continued their search, their initial excitement replaced by a growing sense of unease, a feeling that they had stumbled upon something far more complex, far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. They found another document, a handwritten letter from her father to Vitali, dated just days before his death. The letter spoke of a deal, a partnership, a plan to consolidate their power, to eliminate their enemies. Juliana's world tilted on its axis. Her father, the man she had admired, the man she had believed to be a victim, had been in league with his killer. He had been playing a double game, a game that had ultimately backfired, costing him his life. He betrayed us, she said, her voice filled with bitterness and disbelief. He betrayed everyone. Salvatore didn't answer. He simply stared at the letter, his expression unreadable. He was still loyal, she realized. Even after death, he had an unshakable loyalty. Suddenly, they heard a noise, a faint scraping sound from outside the villa. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Salvatore motioned for Juliana to stay silent. He drew a gun from his waistband, a sleek, black pistol that glinted in the dim light. He moved towards the door, his movements silent, stealthy, his body tensed, ready for action. He peered through the peephole, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in anger. It's Lorenzo, he whispered, his voice tight with fury. He followed us. Juliana felt a surge of fear, a cold knot in her stomach. Lorenzo had discovered their secret, had betrayed them to Vitali. They were trapped. But then, she saw something in Salvatore's eyes, a flicker of something that looked like calculation. A plan forming. Get behind me, he whispered, his voice low and urgent. And stay silent. He opened the door, slowly, cautiously, his gun held ready. Lorenzo stood on the doorstep, a smug smile on his face, a group of armed men flanking him. Well, Lorenzo said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what we have here. The prodigal daughter and her loyal protector. Lorenzo, Salvatore said, his voice calm, controlled, his eyes fixed on his former friend, his former ally. You shouldn't have followed us. I had to, Lorenzo said, his smile fading. Vitali is getting impatient. He wants what's his. And what is that, Lorenzo? Salvatore asked, his voice a low growl. My life? Juliana's life. What price are you willing to pay for your own survival? Whatever it takes, Lorenzo said, his voice hardening. I'm not going down. Not for you. Not for anyone. Salvatore took a step forward, his gun aimed directly at Lorenzo's chest. Then you leave me no choice, he said, his voice cold, deadly. Before Lorenzo, or any of his men, could react. Quick and soundless, Salvatore moved, taking the men down one by one. Lorenzo stared at the scene unfolding, paralyzed. Salvatore turned to him, the gun still on his hand. Now, cousin, he said, with a chilling smile, we have a serpent to catch. It was a massacre. And Juliana watched, in horror and a weird kind of relief, as Salvatore unraveled years of betrayals. One bullet at a time. Chapter 10. Shattered Trust, Broken Vows. The aftermath of the confrontation at the safe house was a blur of adrenaline and fear, of hurried actions and whispered conversations. Salvatore, with ruthless efficiency, disposed of Lorenzo's men, their bodies hidden amongst the olive trees, their deaths a silent testament to the brutal realities of their world. Lorenzo, bound and gagged, was left in the villa, a prisoner in his own family's sanctuary, his betrayal exposed, his fate uncertain. Juliana, still reeling from the shock of the violence, from the revelation of her father's duplicity, struggled to comprehend the events that had transpired, the sudden shift in power, the precariousness of their situation. They returned to the city under the cover of darkness, the incriminating documents from the safe house secured in a hidden compartment in the car. The ride was silent, the tension thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared secret, with the knowledge that they had crossed a line, that there was no turning back. Juliana couldn't shake the image of the photograph, of her father and Vitali, their smiling faces a stark contrast to the bloody reality of their rivalry. She couldn't reconcile the man she had admired, the man she had believed to be a victim, with the ruthless manipulator who had orchestrated his own downfall. She looked at Salvatore, his face grim, his eyes shadowed, his hands tight on the steering wheel. He had killed for her, had protected her, had risked his own life to save hers. But he had also kept secrets from her, had withheld information, had played his own game. "You knew," she said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence. "You knew about my father and Vitali." He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I suspected," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "I saw things, heard things, but I didn't have proof. Not until tonight. Why didn't you tell me?" He glanced at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation.
"I didn't want to believe it," he said.
"I didn't want to betray your father's memory. And I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" she retorted, her voice rising. "You think knowing the truth would hurt me more than being lied to, manipulated, used as a pawn in your game?" "It's not my game, Juliana," he said, his voice hardening. "It's our world. And in this world, trust is a luxury we can't afford." "But we trusted each other," she said, her voice breaking. "Or, at least, I thought we did." He stopped the car, pulling over to the side of the road, the city lights blurring around them. He turned to her, his eyes intense, searching. "I do trust you, Juliana," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "More than anyone. But trust doesn't mean blindly revealing every secret, every vulnerability. It means protecting each other, even from the truth if necessary." "Protecting me?"
she scoffed.
"By lying to me? By keeping me in the dark? By keeping you alive," he said, his voice firm. "By giving us a chance to fight back.
To win."
She looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. She felt betrayed, not only by her father, not only by Lorenzo, but by Salvatore, the man she had loved, the man she had trusted. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. "I don't know who to trust." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "Trust your instincts," he said, his voice soft. "Trust your heart. Trust the feelings that brought you back here, that led you to me." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to discern the truth from the lies, the love from the betrayal. She saw the pain, the regret, the loneliness in his eyes, but she also saw something else, something that mirrored the turmoil within her own heart. A desperate longing, a flicker of hope, a fragile ember of a love that refused to be extinguished. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his, a tentative, questioning touch. He responded, his kiss deepening, becoming more urgent, more passionate, a release of the tension, the fear, the uncertainty that had been building between them. The kiss ended, reluctantly, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling. "We can't do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"Not now."
"Not until we know the truth. Not until we've dealt with Vitali." He nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know," he said. "But just know this, Juliana. Whatever happens, whatever the future holds, I will always protect you. I will always be by your side." He took her hand, giving a gentle, reassuring squeeze. They drove the rest of the way in silence, the unspoken words, the unresolved emotions, hanging heavy in the air. They had shattered the illusion of trust, broken the vows of loyalty, but they had also forged a new bond, a fragile alliance built on shared pain, mutual desire, and a desperate need for redemption. But the road ahead was still dark, still dangerous, still filled with the ghosts of the past and the threats of the present. And the serpent, they knew, was still out there, waiting to strike. Juliana looked to the car's window. The city was reflected on the glass. And, superimposed, she saw her father, Lorenzo, Salvatore, and Vitali's faces. So many lies. And she couldn't tell which ones of them were real. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty, the Cost of Love. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, a desperate race against time to gather evidence, to build a case against Vitali, to expose his crimes and reclaim the Costa family's honor. Juliana and Salvatore worked tirelessly, poring over the documents they had retrieved from the safe house, deciphering coded messages, connecting knots, piecing together the intricate web of Vitali's criminal empire. They discovered that Vitali had been systematically siphoning off funds from the Costa family's businesses, laundering money through shell corporations, bribing officials, and orchestrating a campaign of violence and intimidation to eliminate his rivals. He had been building his power for years, patiently, ruthlessly, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Juliana's father, they realized, had not been entirely innocent. He had been aware of Vitali's activities, had even participated in some of them, hoping to control him, to use him for his own purposes. But he had underestimated Vitali's ambition, his ruthlessness, his willingness to betray anyone, even his closest ally. The photograph, the letter, the evidence they uncovered painted a picture of a complex and dangerous relationship between the two men, a partnership built on mutual greed, mutual distrust, and a shared willingness to cross any line, to break any rule, to achieve their goals. Juliana struggled to reconcile this new image of her father with the man she had known and loved. She felt betrayed, disillusioned, her memories tainted by the knowledge of his duplicity. Salvatore, however, remained surprisingly loyal to the Don's memory. He acknowledged her father's flaws, his mistakes, his willingness to compromise his principles, but he also emphasized his strengths, his cunning, his determination to protect his family, even if it meant making deals with the devil. He was a product of his world, Juliana, Salvatore said one evening, as they were working late in the library. He did what he thought he had to do to survive, to protect what was his. He made mistakes, yes, but he also did good things. He loved you. He loved this family. But he lied, Juliana retorted, her voice filled with bitterness. He lied to everyone. We all lie, Juliana, Salvatore said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. We lie to protect ourselves, to protect those we love, to survive in a world that demands it.
And you?
She asked, her gaze fixed on his. What lies have you told? He hesitated, his expression unreadable. More than I care to admit, he said finally. But I have never lied to you about my feelings. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface, the forbidden touches, the stolen moments, the passionate kisses, had blossomed into something deeper, something stronger, something that defied the dangers, the threats, the betrayals that surrounded them. They had fallen in love again, or perhaps they had never stopped loving each other. But their love was a dangerous game, a forbidden passion that could cost them everything. They knew they had to be careful. Lorenzo was still a threat, even imprisoned in the safe house. Vitali was still out there, powerful and ruthless, his reach extending into every corner of the city. They couldn't afford to be distracted, to be vulnerable, to let their emotions cloud their judgment. But they couldn't help themselves. The stolen moments became more frequent, more intense, a desperate attempt to find solace, to find connection, to find hope in a world that seemed determined to crush them. One night, after a particularly grueling day of deciphering documents and planning their next move, they found themselves alone in the garden, the scent of jasmine and roses filling the air, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Salvatore reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her body trembling with anticipation. We shouldn't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know, he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. But he didn't pull away. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch that quickly deepened into a passionate, desperate kiss. They clung to each other, their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating as one. The world outside ceased to exist, the dangers, the threats, the betrayals fading into insignificance. There was only the two of them, lost in the moment, in the intensity of their forbidden love. The kiss became urgent, a need, a desire, burning and consuming. The price of loyalty, the cost of love. They were willing to pay both, even if it meant risking everything. They knew the risks, but for the first time in a long while, they both felt alive. And they wouldn't let that go without a fight. As they finally broke the kiss, a noise alerted them. Someone was in the house. The fight, it seemed, had found them first. Chapter 12. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. The sound, a faint creak from inside the villa, shattered the intimacy of the moment, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Juliana and Salvatore. They separated quickly, their bodies tensing, their senses heightened, their minds racing. Salvatore drew his gun, his movements silent and practiced, his eyes scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. Juliana, her heart pounding in her chest, instinctively moved behind him, seeking his protection, trusting his instincts. Stay here, he whispered, his voice low and urgent. Don't move. He crept towards the villa, his body low to the ground, his gun held ready. Juliana, despite her fear, disobeyed his order, following him silently, her eyes fixed on his back, her hand clutching the small silver cross she wore around her neck, a silent prayer escaping her lips. The villa was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the city in the distance. The shadows seemed to dance and shift, playing tricks on their eyes, creating illusions of movement where there was none. They moved through the familiar rooms, the grand salon, the formal dining room, the wood-paneled study, each step measured, cautious, their senses on high alert. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken threat of danger, with the knowledge that they were not alone. They reached the library, the room where they had spent countless hours poring over documents, deciphering codes, sharing secrets. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. Salvatore signaled for Juliana to stay back. He took a deep breath, his finger tightening on the trigger, and then, with a swift, decisive movement, he kicked the door open, his gun aimed, ready to fire. The room was empty, or so it seemed. A figure emerged from behind a bookshelf, a tall, slender woman with piercing blue eyes and a cascade of silver hair. It was Isabella, Juliana's aunt, her father's younger sister, a woman she hadn't seen in years. Isabella? Juliana gasped, her voice filled with disbelief.
What are you doing here?
Isabella, her expression a mixture of surprise and relief, lowered the small, antique pistol she had been holding.
Juliana?
She said, her voice trembling slightly.
Salvatore?
Thank God you're alive. The tension in the room eased slightly, but the underlying sense of unease remained. Isabella was a wild card, an unknown quantity. She had always been an enigma, a woman who lived on the fringes of the Costa family, a woman who had seemingly rejected the world of the mafia, choosing a life of art and solitude. What are you doing here, Isabella? Salvatore asked, his voice still cautious, his gun lowered but not holstered. I came to warn you, Isabella said, her voice urgent. Vitali knows. He knows about the safe house, about the documents, about everything. Juliana felt a chill run down her spine.
How? She asked.
Lorenzo, Isabella said, her voice filled with disgust. He escaped. He contacted Vitali. He's offered to deliver you, to deliver the documents, in exchange for his life. Salvatore cursed under his breath, his grip tightening on his gun.
We need to move, he said. Now.
Wait, Isabella said, holding up her hand. There's more. Vitali is planning something big. Something catastrophic. He's not just after the Costa family. He's after the entire city. What do you mean? Juliana asked, her voice filled with dread. Isabella explained that Vitali, through his network of corrupt officials and his control of key businesses, had been planning a series of coordinated attacks designed to cripple the city, to create chaos and panic, to establish himself as the undisputed ruler of Naples. He's planning to bomb the port, Isabella said, her voice trembling. The train station. The historical center. He wants to bring the city to its knees. Juliana and Salvatore exchanged a look of horror. This was far bigger, far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. It wasn't just about their family, their survival. It was about the fate of the entire city. We have to stop him, Juliana said, her voice firm, resolute.
But how?
Salvatore asked. He has the police, the politicians, the entire underworld in his pocket. Isabella stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with determination.
Not everyone, she said.
There are still some who are loyal to the old ways, to the code of honor. There are still some who are willing to fight. She revealed that she had been secretly working with a network of dissidents, former members of the Costa family and other rival clans who had grown disillusioned with Vitali's ruthlessness, his disregard for tradition, his insatiable greed. We have been gathering information, building a case, waiting for the right moment to strike, Isabella said. And now, with the documents you have, with your leadership, we have a chance. A chance to stop him, to save the city. A glimmer of hope, a faint spark in the darkness. They were not alone. They had allies. They had a chance to fight back, not just for themselves, but for the entire city. It was a huge responsibility. We need a plan, Salvatore said, his mind racing, calculating the odds, assessing the risks. I have one, Isabella said, a faint smile playing on her lips. But it's dangerous. It will require courage, cunning, and a willingness to sacrifice everything. She looked at Juliana, and then at Salvatore. Are you in? They nodded, almost at the same time.
Good, she said.
Because time is running out. And the serpent is about to unleash hell. The three of them, an unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of betrayal and danger, stood together, ready to face the storm. Chapter 13. Echoes of Violence, Whispers of Peace. Isabella's plan was audacious, a multi-pronged attack designed to expose Vitali's crimes, disrupt his network, and ultimately, to bring him down. It relied on speed, secrecy, and the element of surprise, a desperate gamble with the fate of the city hanging in the balance. The first step was to leak the information from the safe house documents to a trusted journalist, a woman known for her integrity and her fearlessness, someone who could expose Vitali's corruption to the public, to ignite a firestorm of outrage and demand for justice. Juliana, using her contacts from her previous life, her network of friends and colleagues who had no connection to the mafia, arranged the meeting, ensuring the journalist's safety, providing her with the evidence she needed to break the story. The second step was to coordinate with Isabella's network of dissidents, to gather their forces, to prepare for a confrontation with Vitali's men. Salvatore, using his knowledge of the city's underworld, his contacts within the various clans, his reputation as a ruthless enforcer, rallied the troops, uniting them under a common banner, a shared desire to overthrow Vitali and restore order to the city. The third step was the most dangerous, the most personal. Juliana and Salvatore, armed with a knowledge of Vitali's planned attacks, would confront him directly, to disrupt his plans, to prevent the chaos and bloodshed he intended to unleash upon the city. They knew the risks were enormous, that they were walking into a trap, that they might not survive. But they were driven by a sense of duty, a sense of responsibility, a desire to protect the innocent, to avenge the wrongs that had been committed, to build a better future for themselves, for their city. The echoes of violence reverberated through the city, a series of carefully orchestrated attacks and counterattacks, a shadow war fought in the back alleys, in the abandoned warehouses, in the opulent villas of the powerful. The streets became a battleground, the tension palpable, the fear a constant companion. Juliana and Salvatore, working side by side, relying on each other's strengths, trusting each other's instincts, moved through the city like shadows, disrupting Vitali's operations, sabotaging his plans, eliminating his key lieutenants. They were a force to be reckoned with, a pair of avenging angels, driven by a righteous fury and a desperate hope for redemption. The whispers of peace, however, were faint, almost imperceptible, drowned out by the clamor of violence, by the cries of the innocent, by the threats of the powerful. But they were there, in the acts of courage and defiance, in the moments of compassion and kindness, in the unwavering determination of those who refused to surrender to the darkness. Juliana found herself drawing strength from unexpected sources, from the resilience of the ordinary people of Naples, from their unwavering spirit, their refusal to be cowed by fear, their willingness to help, to shelter, to protect those in need. She saw the best and the worst of humanity, the depths of depravity and the heights of heroism, the darkness of greed and the light of compassion. And she realized that the fight was not just about defeating Vitali. It was about reclaiming the soul of the city, about restoring its heart, about building a future where peace could prevail over violence, where justice could triumph over corruption. One evening, after a particularly harrowing encounter with Vitali's men, Juliana and Salvatore found themselves seeking refuge in a small, hidden church, a sanctuary of peace amidst the chaos of the city. They sat in the silence, their bodies bruised and aching, their spirits weary, their hearts heavy with the burden of their task. "Do you think we can do this?" Juliana asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think we can win?" Salvatore looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "I don't know," he said, "but we have to try. We have to fight. For ourselves. For the city. For the future." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, finding solace in his presence, in his strength, in his love. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," he said. "Me too." But he didn't pull away. He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, offering her comfort, protection, a moment of peace in the midst of the storm. A promise. They knew the final confrontation was coming, the inevitable showdown with Vitali, the ultimate test of their courage, their loyalty, their love. And they knew that the whispers of peace might be silenced forever, drowned out by the echoes of violence. But even in the face of uncertainty, even with death being a possible outcome, they wouldn't falter. They would fight. Together. The church's bell started ringing, signaling the hour. Or maybe an omen. Chapter 14. The Unraveling of Secrets. The journalist, true to her word, published the expose, a meticulously researched and damning account of Vitali's crimes, his network of corruption, his plans for the city. The article hit Naples like a bombshell, igniting a firestorm of public outrage, triggering a wave of protests and demonstrations, demanding justice, demanding accountability. The police, forced to act by the overwhelming public pressure and the irrefutable evidence presented in the article, launched an investigation, raiding Vitali's properties, arresting his key associates, seizing his assets. The carefully constructed facade of legitimacy, the veil of civility that Vitali had maintained for years, began to crumble, revealing the ruthless criminal beneath. Vitali, however, was not one to surrender easily. He retaliated with a series of brutal attacks, targeting the journalist, the police investigators, anyone who dared to oppose him. The city plunged deeper into chaos, the violence escalating, the streets becoming even more dangerous. Juliana and Salvatore, working with Isabella and her network of dissidents, fought back, protecting the innocent, disrupting Vitali's operations, providing information to the authorities, doing everything they could to contain the damage, to prevent the city from spiraling into complete anarchy. They knew that Vitali's ultimate plan, the bombing of the port, the train station, and the historical center, was still in motion. He was desperate, cornered, willing to do anything to maintain his power, to inflict maximum damage, to prove that he was still in control. They raced against time, trying to decipher the details of his plan, to identify the locations of the bombs, to find a way to disarm them before it was too late. The pressure was immense, the stakes impossibly high, the weight of the city's fate resting on their shoulders. During their investigation, they stumbled upon another secret, A hidden connection between Vitali and a powerful politician, a man who had been considered a pillar of the community, a champion of justice, a man who had publicly condemned Vitali's actions. The evidence was irrefutable. The politician had been secretly collaborating with Vitali, providing him with information, protecting him from prosecution, profiting from his crimes. He was the mastermind behind Vitali's rise to power, the puppet master pulling the strings, the true architect of the city's descent into darkness. Juliana was shocked, disillusioned, her faith in the institutions, in the system, shattered once again. She had believed in the rule of law, in the power of justice, in the possibility of a better world. But the reality was far more complex, far more corrupt, far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Salvatore, however, was not surprised. He had always been cynical, distrustful of authority, skeptical of those who claimed to represent the interests of the people. He had seen too much, experienced too much, to believe in anything but the law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest. "This changes everything," Juliana said, her voice trembling with anger and frustration. "We can't just expose Vitali. We have to expose them all. We have to tear down the entire system." "It's not that simple, Juliana," Salvatore said, his voice cautious. "We're talking about powerful people, people with connections, people who will do anything to protect themselves." "I don't care," she retorted. "We have to try. We have to fight. For the truth. For justice. For the future." He looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration and a touch of fear. He had always admired her strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief in the good. But he also knew that her idealism, her naivete, could be a liability, a weakness that could be exploited. "We'll do it together," he said, his voice firm. "But we have to be careful. We have to be smart. We can't afford to make any mistakes." They decided to leak the information about the politician to a different journalist, a rival of the first one, someone who would be eager to scoop the story, someone who would be less likely to be intimidated or silenced. The second expose hit even harder than the first, triggering a political earthquake, shaking the foundations of the city's power structure, leading to resignations, arrests, and a complete overhaul of the local government. The unraveling of secrets had begun. The truth was emerging, slowly, painfully, but inexorably. The city was awakening, rising up against the corruption, the violence, the injustice that had plagued it for so long. But Vitali was still out there, still planning his final, desperate act of destruction. And time, they knew, was running out. They had the proof. They had the plan. All they needed was to find Vitali before he found them. Juliana couldn't shake the feeling that they were being played, somehow. The puzzle pieces, although they were forming a cohesive image, left a bitter taste in her mouth. As if the truth was still hidden. Chapter 15. Masks fall. Truths emerge. The information from Isabella's network pinpointed Vitali's location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, near the port. It was a heavily fortified compound, guarded by a small army of loyal henchmen, a desperate last stand for a man who had lost everything but his desire for revenge. Juliana and Salvatore, along with a small group of Isabella's dissidents, prepared for the final confrontation. They knew the odds were stacked against them, that they were walking into a trap, that they might not survive. But they were determined to stop Vitali, to prevent him from carrying out his plan, to save the city from his wrath. They armed themselves with weapons, gathered their courage, and set out under the cover of darkness, the city lights twinkling in the distance, a silent witness to their desperate mission. The warehouse was a sprawling, dilapidated structure, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. The air was thick with tension, with the smell of diesel fuel and gunpowder, with the unspoken threat of violence. They breached the perimeter silently, expertly disabling the security cameras, neutralizing the guards, moving through the shadows like ghosts. They encountered resistance, pockets of resistance from Vitali's. Quick and lethal, Salvatore led the small group, clearing their path. They reached the main building, a vast, cavernous space filled with crates, machinery, and the ominous ticking of a clock. They found Vitali, standing in the center of the room, surrounded by his remaining loyalists, a detonator in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. "Welcome," Vitaly said, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "I've been expecting you." "It's over, Vitaly," Salvatore said, his voice firm, his gun aimed. "Surrender." Vitaly laughed, a harsh, chilling sound.
"Surrender?" he scoffed.
"Never. I will bring this city to its knees. I will make them pay for what they did to me." "You did this to yourself," Vitaly, Juliana said, her voice clear and strong. "Your greed, your ambition, your ruthlessness. You destroyed yourself." "You know nothing," Vitaly snarled. "You think you've won? You think you've exposed me? You're fools. You're pawns in a game you don't even understand." He gestured toward a large screen on the wall, which flickered to life, revealing a live video feed. It showed the port, the train station, the historical center, each location rigged with explosives, the timers counting down. "In a few minutes," Vitaly said, his voice filled with a chilling calmness, "this city will be ashes. And you will be buried with it." Juliana felt a surge of despair, a cold knot in her stomach. They had failed. They were too late. But then Salvatore did something unexpected. He lowered his gun. "You're right, Vitaly," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "We are pawns. But we're not your pawns." He turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and determination. "I'm sorry, Juliana," he said. "I lied to you. I lied to everyone. But I did it for a reason." He revealed the truth, the final, devastating secret that had been hidden for so long. He was not just her father's protégé, his right-hand man. He was his son, his illegitimate son, the product of a secret affair, a child who had been raised in the shadows, trained to be a weapon, groomed to take over the family, to fulfill a destiny he had never chosen. Her father and Vitaly had been partners, yes, but not in the way she had imagined. They had been playing a double game, a dangerous game of deception and betrayal, each one trying to outmaneuver the other, each one seeking to control the city, to build their own empire. But her father had had a change of heart. He had realized the error of his ways, the destructive path he had chosen. He had decided to break away from Vitaly, to expose his crimes, to make amends for his mistakes. He had entrusted Salvatore with the task, with the mission of bringing down Vitaly, of saving the city, of redeeming the Costa family name. He had known that he would be killed, that Vitaly would never let him betray him. But he had been willing to sacrifice himself, to pay the ultimate price, for the greater good. Salvatore had been playing a double game all along, pretending to be loyal to Vitaly, while secretly working to undermine him, gathering evidence, preparing for the final confrontation. He had used Juliana, manipulated her, lied to her, to protect the plan, to ensure that her father's sacrifice would not be in vain. The masks had fallen. The truths had emerged. The game was over. Juliana stared at Salvatore, her mind reeling, her heart breaking. She had loved him, trusted him, believed in him, and he had betrayed her, used her, lied to her. But she also understood. She understood the impossible choices he had faced, the burden he had carried, the sacrifices he had made. She understood that his love for her, his desire to protect her, had been real, even amidst the lies, the deception, the betrayal. "It's not too late," Salvatore said, his voice filled with urgency. "We can still stop him. We can still save the city." He turned to Vitaly, his eyes filled with a cold, deadly determination. "You may have killed my father," he said, "but you will not win. You will not destroy the city. I will not let you." He raised his gun, aimed at the detonator in Vitaly's hand. The final showdown had begun. But this time, with all cards on the table. And maybe a chance to finally be free. Chapter 16. A desperate plea, a dangerous gamble. Vitaly, his eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the detonator, sneered at Salvatore. "You think you can stop me, boy? You're nothing. A bastard son, a shadow of your father, a pawn in a game you never understood." "I understand enough," Salvatore retorted, his voice cold, his stance unwavering. "I understand that you're a monster, a cancer on this city, and I'm going to cut you out." The tension in the warehouse was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of fear and anticipation. Juliana, her mind still reeling from Salvatore's revelation, from the shattering of her illusions, from the realization of the depth of his deception and the magnitude of his sacrifice, watched the two men, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She knew that this was the moment of truth, the final confrontation, the culmination of years of lies, betrayals, and violence. The fate of the city, the lives of countless innocent people, hung in the balance. She looked at Salvatore, at the man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her, the man who was now her only hope. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the loneliness, but she also saw the determination, the courage, the unwavering resolve. She knew that he was telling the truth, that his love for her, his desire to protect her, had been real, even amidst the lies, the deception. She understood the impossible choices he had faced, the burden he had carried, the sacrifices he had made. She forgave him. She stepped forward, placing herself between Salvatore and Vitali, her voice clear and strong. "Stop this, Vitali," she pleaded. "It's not too late. You can still choose a different path. You can still choose redemption." Vitali laughed, a harsh, mocking sound.
"Redemption?" he scoffed.
"There is no redemption for me. There is only power. And I will have it, even if it means destroying everything." "Power is not everything," Juliana said. "There is love, there is loyalty, there is compassion. There is a better way." "You're naive, Juliana," Vitali said, his voice softening slightly, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing his face. "You always were, just like your father." "My father made mistakes," Juliana said, "but he also did good things. He loved this city. He loved his family. And he tried to make amends for his sins." "He failed," Vitali said, his voice hardening again. "He was weak. And weakness is a disease. A disease that I will eradicate." He raised the detonator, his finger hovering over the button. "It's over," he said. "Say goodbye to your precious city." Juliana knew that she had one last chance, a desperate gamble, a risky maneuver that could either save them all or condemn them to death. She had to appeal to the last shred of humanity, if any remained, within Vitali's twisted soul. "Don Antonio was your friend," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You were like brothers. You shared everything. You built an empire together. What happened? Where did it all go wrong?" Vitali hesitated, his finger pausing over the button, his eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and pain. "He betrayed me," he said, his voice low and strained. "He turned on me. He tried to destroy me." "He tried to save you," Juliana countered. "He tried to save you from yourself, from the darkness that was consuming you. He offered you a way out. He offered you forgiveness." "Forgiveness?" Vitali scoffed. "There is no forgiveness. There is only revenge." "There is always forgiveness, Vitali," Juliana said, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "There is always a chance for redemption. It's not too late. Let it go. Let the city live. Let us live." She looked at him, her eyes pleading, her heart aching for the man he once was, for the friend her father had lost, for the lost soul trapped within the monster. Vitali stared at her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He was torn, his desire for revenge battling with the last vestiges of his humanity, his hatred warring with the memory of his friendship with her father, his twisted ambition clashing with a faint glimmer of hope that Juliana's words had ignited. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the silence in the warehouse deafening, the tension unbearable. The fate of the city hung on a single word, a single decision, a single flicker of conscience within a man consumed by darkness. Finally, Vitali lowered the detonator, his hand trembling, his eyes filled with a mixture of defeat and resignation. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't do it." A collective sigh of relief swept through the warehouse. The bombs were deactivated. The city was saved. But the battle was not over. Vitali's men, seeing their leaders surrender, opened fire, a desperate last stand, a final act of defiance. Salvatore reacted instantly, pushing Juliana to the ground, shielding her with his body, returning fire, his movements swift and precise, his aim deadly. The warehouse erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, a chaotic melee of violence and desperation. Juliana, huddled on the floor, her ears ringing, her body trembling, watched in horror as Salvatore fought, a lone warrior against a sea of enemies, his courage unwavering, his determination absolute. He was protecting her. He was saving her. He was sacrificing himself for her. And she knew she couldn't let him die. Not like this. Chapter 17. The lioness bares her claws. Juliana, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect Salvatore, scrambled to her feet, ignoring the bullets whizzing past her, the shouts and screams of the men fighting around her. She grabbed a discarded weapon, a heavy metal pipe, and charged into the fray, her movements surprisingly agile, her aim surprisingly accurate. She swung the pipe with all her might, connecting with the head of one of Vitali's men, sending him sprawling to the ground. She struck another, and another, her anger, her fear, her desperation fueling her actions, transforming her from a grieving daughter, a manipulated pawn, into a fierce warrior, a lioness protecting her own. She fought alongside Salvatore, their movements synchronized, their actions complementing each other, a deadly dance of violence and survival. They moved as one, protecting each other's backs, covering each other's flanks, their shared history, their rediscovered love, their mutual determination uniting them in a desperate fight for their lives. Isabella and her dissidents joined the battle, their numbers bolstering their ranks, their weapons adding to the firepower, turning the tide of the fight. The warehouse became a scene of chaos and carnage, a brutal struggle for dominance, a final showdown between good and evil. Juliana, despite her lack of experience, fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She had tapped into a primal instinct, a deep-seated need to protect those she loved, to defend what she believed in, to fight for her survival. She was no longer the naive, innocent woman who had returned to Naples seeking answers. She was a warrior, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with. She saw Vitali, standing near the deactivated detonator, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, his eyes watching the battle unfold, his plans crumbling around him. He was unarmed, vulnerable, his power shattered, his empire in ruins. She moved towards him, her weapon raised, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pity. She could kill him, end his life, avenge her father's death, eliminate the threat he posed once and for all. But she hesitated. She looked at him, at the broken, defeated man before her, and she saw not a monster, but a lost soul, a victim of his own ambition, his own greed, his own darkness. She saw the friend her father had lost, the man who had betrayed him, the man who had caused so much pain and suffering. She lowered her weapon. "It's over, Vitali," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's time to stop." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and resignation. He knew he was defeated. He knew he had lost. "You should kill me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "No," Juliana said. "I won't become like you. I won't let the darkness win. I choose a different path. I choose justice, not revenge. I choose hope, not despair." She turned away from him, leaving him to his fate, to the judgment of the law, to the consequences of his actions. She had made her choice. She had chosen mercy over vengeance, compassion over hatred, love over fear. The fighting subsided, the gunfire dwindling, the shouts and screams fading into silence. Vitali's men were either dead, wounded, or had surrendered. The battle was over. They had won. Juliana looked around the warehouse, at the scene of carnage, at the bodies of the fallen, at the faces of the survivors. She saw the exhaustion, the pain, the relief, the gratitude in their eyes. She saw Salvatore, standing a few feet away, his body bruised and battered, his clothes torn and stained with blood, but his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and love. He walked towards her, his steps slow but steady, his gaze unwavering. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "You were amazing," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You saved us all." "We saved each other," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. They embraced, their bodies clinging to each other, their hearts beating as one. They had survived. They had won. They had found their way back to each other, through the darkness, through the violence, through the betrayal. But the scars remained, both physical and emotional. They had a long way to go. The sirens of the approaching police cars wailed in the distance, a signal of the end, and, maybe, of a new beginning. Juliana looked at the approaching lights, feeling, for the first time in a very long time, a glimmer of hope. Chapter 18. Blood will tell. Fate will decide. The arrival of the police marked the beginning of the end, the transition from the chaotic world of the mafia to the structured realm of the law. Vitali and his surviving henchmen were arrested, taken into custody, their reign of terror finally over. The bombs were disarmed, the city was safe, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Juliana and Salvatore, along with Isabella and her dissidents, were hailed as heroes, their courage and determination praised, their actions lauded as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of good over evil. But the aftermath of the battle was far from peaceful. The city was in turmoil, the political landscape shattered, the social fabric torn. The investigations into Vitali's crimes and the complicity of the politician revealed a vast network of corruption, a web of deceit and betrayal that reached into every corner of Neapolitan society. Juliana, despite her exhaustion, her emotional wounds, her desire to retreat from the world, found herself drawn into the effort to rebuild, to restore order, to heal the city's wounds. She testified before commissions, provided evidence to investigators, spoke out against corruption, advocated for justice, became a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of hope for a better future. Salvatore, his true identity revealed, his past exposed, faced a different set of challenges. He was questioned by the police, scrutinized by the media, judged by the public. He was the son of a mafia don, a man who had committed terrible crimes, a man who had betrayed his own family, his own city. But he was also the man who had stopped Vitali, the man who had saved the city, the man who had risked his own life to protect the innocent. He was a complex figure, a paradox, a man who embodied both the darkness and the light, the violence and the compassion, the betrayal and the loyalty. He cooperated with the authorities, providing them with information about the inner workings of the mafia, helping them to dismantle the remaining criminal networks, to bring the perpetrators to justice. He used his knowledge, his skills, his connections to atone for his past, to make amends for his sins, to build a new life, a new identity. The question of their future, of their relationship, hung in the air, unspoken, uncertain. Could they overcome the past, the betrayals, the violence, the lies? Could they build a life together, a life free from the shadows of the mafia, a life based on trust, on honesty, on love? One evening, as they were walking along the waterfront, the city lights twinkling around them, the sea breeze gently caressing their faces, Juliana finally broached the subject. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. Salvatore looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and uncertainty.
"I don't know," he said.
"I have to face the consequences of my actions, of my past. I may have to go to prison. I'll wait for you," Juliana said, her voice firm, resolute. "However long it takes." He smiled, a sad, tender smile.
"You shouldn't," he said.
"You deserve better. You deserve a normal life, a life free from all this darkness." "There is no normal life for me, Salvatore," she said. "Not anymore. My life is here. With you. Whatever happens." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, their touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "I love you, Juliana," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I have always loved you. And I will always love you. And I love you, Salvatore, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Despite everything. Because of everything. They stood there, holding each other, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one, the city lights reflecting in their eyes, a silent promise of a future together, a future uncertain, but filled with hope, with love, with the possibility of redemption. Blood will tell, fate will decide. But they had made their choice. They had chosen each other. They had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, light over darkness. And they would face the future together, whatever it may hold. They kissed, a promise of forever. A promise that this time they would keep. The sea, a witness of so much violence, reflected the moon, as if approving their union, their new beginning. Chapter 19. Redemption's Embrace, Sacrifice's Shadow. The legal proceedings against Salvatore were lengthy and complex, a media circus that captivated the city, that divided public opinion, that tested the limits of justice and mercy. He was charged with a litany of crimes, stemming from his association with the mafia, his involvement in his father's and Vitali's operations, his own actions during his years as an enforcer. Juliana stood by him, unwavering in her support, attending every hearing, testifying on his behalf, speaking out in his defense, arguing that he had been a victim of circumstance, a child forced into a life of violence, a man who had ultimately chosen the path of redemption, a hero who had saved the city from destruction. Isabella, too, testified on Salvatore's behalf, revealing the full extent of her father's plan, his intention to use Salvatore to dismantle Vitali's empire, his willingness to sacrifice himself and his son for the greater good. She presented evidence, gathered over years of clandestine investigation, that corroborated Salvatore's story, that painted a picture of a man caught between two worlds, a man who had ultimately chosen the side of light. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture, portraying Salvatore as a ruthless criminal, a cold-blooded killer, a man who deserved the harshest possible punishment. They presented evidence of his past crimes, his violent acts, his association with known criminals, arguing that his 11th-hour conversion was nothing more than a cynical ploy to escape justice. The trial was a battle of narratives, a clash of ideologies, a test of the city's ability to forgive, to heal, to move forward. The courtroom was packed every day, the atmosphere tense, the emotions raw, the outcome uncertain. Juliana, sitting in the gallery, watching Salvatore, her heart aching for him, her mind racing with worry, felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She knew that his fate rested not only on the evidence, on the arguments of the lawyers, but on the hearts and minds of the jury, on their willingness to see beyond his past, to recognize his transformation, to believe in the possibility of redemption. She also knew that she had a role to play, a responsibility to speak out, to defend him, to fight for him, to show the world the man she loved, the man who had saved her, the man who had saved the city. During her testimony, she spoke passionately, eloquently, about Salvatore's character, his courage, his compassion, his love for her, his love for the city. She recounted the events of the past few months, the dangers they had faced, the sacrifices they had made, the choices they had made together. "He is not the man he used to be," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He has changed. He has redeemed himself. He deserves a second chance. He deserves to be free." Her words resonated with the jury, with the public, with the media. She had become a symbol of hope, a voice for forgiveness, a testament to the power of love to transform even the darkest of souls. The jury deliberated for days, their decision shrouded in secrecy, the tension in the city reaching fever pitch. Finally, they reached a verdict. Salvatore was found guilty of some of the lesser charges, but acquitted of the most serious ones. He was sentenced to a relatively short prison term, a sentence that acknowledged his past crimes but also recognized his cooperation with the authorities, his role in saving the city, his genuine remorse. It was a compromise, a balance between justice and mercy, a reflection of the city's divided opinion, a testament to the complexities of the human condition. Juliana, though relieved that Salvatore had been spared the worst, felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss. She knew that even a short prison term would be a hardship, a separation, a test of their love. But she also knew that they would survive it, that they would emerge stronger, more resilient, more committed to each other. They had faced death, betrayal, violence, and they had overcome it all. They could overcome this, too. As Salvatore was led away, he turned to her, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "I'll be back," he whispered. "Wait for me." "Always," she replied, her voice firm, her heart filled with a bittersweet mixture of sorrow and hope. The shadow of sacrifice still lingered, but the embrace of redemption was drawing near. They had paid the price, they had faced the consequences, and they had emerged, scarred but not broken, ready to face the future, together. She watched him leave, and she prepared to be there when he returned. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The years of Salvatore's imprisonment were a period of quiet reflection, of personal growth, of rebuilding and healing for both Juliana and the city of Naples. Juliana dedicated herself to working with charitable organizations, helping to rebuild communities ravaged by Vitali's violence, supporting victims of crime, advocating for social justice, becoming a beacon of hope and resilience for a city scarred by its past. She visited Salvatore regularly, their meetings a lifeline, a connection to the love that sustained them through the separation. They talked, they wrote letters, they shared their hopes and dreams, their fears and anxieties, their unwavering commitment to each other, their determination to build a new life together, free from the shadows of the mafia. Salvatore, during his incarceration, used the time to educate himself, to study law, to understand the system that had both condemned and, in a way, saved him. He became a model prisoner, earning the respect of both inmates and guards, his quiet strength, his inherent sense of justice, his commitment to redemption shining through. He also worked with the authorities, providing them with valuable information about the remaining criminal networks, helping them to dismantle the last vestiges of Vitali's empire, to bring closure to the city's long nightmare. Naples, too, began to heal, slowly but surely. The corrupt officials were removed from power, replaced by a new generation of leaders committed to transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. The city's economy began to recover, new businesses flourished, tourism returned, and a sense of optimism, of hope for the future, began to permeate the air. The wounds of the past, however, remained, a constant reminder of the price of violence, of the fragility of peace, of the importance of vigilance, and the need for constant struggle against the forces of darkness. Finally, the day arrived when Salvatore was released from prison. Juliana was waiting for him outside the gates, her heart pounding with anticipation, her eyes filled with tears of joy. He walked out, a free man, his head held high, his eyes clear, his step firm. He had aged, his face lined with the marks of his experiences, his hair streaked with more silver, but his spirit remained unbroken, his determination unwavering. They embraced, a long, passionate embrace, a reunion of souls, a merging of hearts, a silent promise of a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. "Welcome home," Juliana whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's good to be home," Salvatore replied, his voice hoarse, his eyes filled with love. They returned to the villa, to the place where their journey had begun, the place that held so many memories, both good and bad, the place that was now their home, their sanctuary, their haven. They walked through the garden, hand in hand, the scent of roses and jasmine filling the air, the city lights twinkling in the distance, a symbol of hope, of resilience, of rebirth. They stood by the fountain, the place where they had first spoken, where they had first acknowledged their feelings, where they had first dared to dream of a future together. "We did it," Juliana said, her voice filled with wonder. "We survived. We won." "We did," Salvatore agreed. "But it wasn't just us. It was the city, the people, the spirit of Naples. It refused to be broken." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "And it was you," he said. "You were the strength. the courage,
The hope.
you never gave up. You never lost faith.
You saved me.
You saved us all. We saved each other, Juliana said, her voice trembling slightly. They kissed a long, tender kiss, a seal of their love, a promise of their future, a celebration of their victory. But even in that moment of joy, of peace, of fulfillment, there was a lingering sense of unease, a shadow of the past that refused to be completely erased. They knew that the world was not a perfect place, that the forces of darkness were always lurking, that the fight for justice, for peace, for love, was a never-ending struggle. As they were about to enter the villa, a figure emerged from the shadows. A young man, barely more than a boy, with dark eyes and a familiar face.
Salvatore De Rossi?
He asked, his voice hesitant, his gaze fixed on the older man. Salvatore stiffened, his hand instinctively moving towards his side, where he used to carry a gun. Yes, Salvatore said, his voice cautious.
Who are you?
My name is Marco, the young man said.
Marco Vitali.
Juliana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
Vitali est son.
The final confrontation, it seemed, was not over. The past had returned, seeking revenge, seeking justice, seeking closure. I'm here to talk, Marco said, his voice trembling slightly. I want to understand. He explained that he had been away, studying abroad, unaware of his father's crimes, of the events that had transpired in Naples. He had returned to find his family shattered, his father imprisoned, his name disgraced. He had read the articles, watched the news reports, listened to the stories. He had learned the truth, or at least a version of the truth. And he had come seeking answers, seeking understanding, seeking justice? Salvatore looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and compassion. He saw in the young man's face a reflection of himself, a young man caught in a web of violence, of betrayal, of inherited sins.
What do you want to know?
Salvatore asked. I want to know the truth, Marco said. About my father.
About you.
About everything. Salvatore and Juliana exchanged a look. This was a moment of reckoning, a chance to finally break the cycle of violence, to confront the past, to heal the wounds, to build a future based on truth, on understanding, on forgiveness. A future free from revenge. Come in, Salvatore said, his voice calm, his hand gesturing towards the villa. We have a lot to talk about. The lioness and the former enforcer invited the serpent's son into their home. The future was uncertain, but they had a chance to choose a different path. Epilogue. The conversation with Marco Vitali stretched late into the night, a painful, cathartic exploration of the past, a careful unraveling of the tangled web of lies, betrayals, and violence that had defined their families for generations. Salvatore and Juliana told their story, honestly, unflinchingly, holding nothing back, revealing the full extent of their father's actions, their own complicity, their struggles, their choices. Marco listened intently, his initial anger and resentment slowly giving way to a dawning understanding, a grudging respect, a flicker of compassion. He saw the pain in their eyes, the regret, the genuine remorse. He heard the truth in their voices, the sincerity of their desire for redemption, their commitment to building a different future. He learned about his father's crimes, his ruthlessness, his ambition, but he also learned about his humanity, his vulnerabilities, his love for his family, his misguided belief that he was doing what was necessary to protect them. He learned about Salvatore's father, the Don, the man who had betrayed his own friend, but who had also tried to make amends, who had ultimately sacrificed himself in an attempt to break the cycle of violence. He learned about Juliana, the woman who had lost everything, who had been manipulated and betrayed, but who had never lost her faith in the good, who had fought for justice, for peace, for love. And he learned about Salvatore, the man who had been raised in the shadows, trained to be a killer, but who had chosen a different path, who had risked his own life to save the city, who had found redemption in love, in compassion, in forgiveness. By the time the first rays of dawn painted the sky with hues of pink and orange, a fragile understanding had been reached, a tentative truce established. Marco did not forgive his father's killers, nor did he condone their actions, but he acknowledged their humanity, their struggles, their choices. He decided to leave Naples, to return to his studies, to build a life for himself, a life free from the shadows of the mafia, a life dedicated to justice, to peace, to making a positive contribution to the world. He would carry the burden of his family's past, but he would not be defined by it. He would choose his own path. Before he left, he turned to Salvatore and Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "for telling me the truth, for giving me a chance to understand." He extended his hand, first to Salvatore, then to Juliana. They shook hands, a silent acknowledgement of their shared history, their shared pain, their shared hope for a better future. As Marco walked away, disappearing into the morning mist, Juliana and Salvatore stood together, watching him go, their hearts filled with a bittersweet mixture of relief and sorrow. They had faced the final confrontation, not with violence, not with revenge, but with honesty, with compassion, with forgiveness. They had broken the cycle. Years passed. Juliana and Salvatore lived a quiet, peaceful life in the villa, their love a constant source of strength, of comfort, of joy. They continued to work for the betterment of the city, supporting charitable causes, advocating for social justice, becoming pillars of their community. They never forgot the past, the lessons they had learned, the sacrifices they had made, the price they had paid. But they did not dwell on it. They focused on the present, on building a future filled with love, with peace, with hope. The villa, once a symbol of power, of violence, of darkness, became a haven of peace, of healing, of light. The garden, once a place of stolen moments and forbidden touches, blossomed with new life, a testament to the enduring power of love, of forgiveness, of redemption. One sunny afternoon, as they were sitting in the garden, enjoying the warmth of the sun, the scent of the roses, the gentle breeze from the sea, Juliana turned to Salvatore, her eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "We did it," she said, her voice soft, filled with wonder. "We really did it." Salvatore smiled, his hand reaching out to take hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, their touch a silent promise of forever. "Yes," he said, "we did. Together." And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the garden, by the peace of their home, by the love that had sustained them through it all, they knew that they had finally found their happily ever after, a hard-won peace, a well-deserved redemption, a love that had conquered all. The serpent was gone, and the lioness could finally rest. The end.